We are, have attempted to tackle modern Jewish thought in 8 or 9 weeks. That is obviously, impossible task. And in thinking of today, there are just so many different directions that I found myself getting pulled in when I was preparing for this. So I can kind of give a couple of headlines and then we can dig into the topic that I ultimately settled on. Just to paint the picture a little bit, the last 2 weeks we talked about Zionism and anti-Zionism, which very much erupted onto the Jewish scene in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And this would only grow as a Jewish movement, obviously, as the 1900s go on. I actually was just talking to a professor of American Jewish history, Zev Elef, and we were talking about how in the American Jewish community, Zionism was virtually a non-issue until World War I. In other words, if you took a time machine and popped into virtually any American Jewish community, it didn't make a difference if it was Reform or conservative or Orthodox or, an unaffiliated Jew in the year, 1902, we'll just pick a random year. You can bet 9 times out of 10 that person was not a Zionist, and in all probability, they probably didn't even have strong opinions. And so unlike last week where we saw a lot of Jewish thinkers having very strong ideologic anti-Zionist opinions for all the ideas that we discussed last week, your average American Jew, it wasn't even on their radar, right? Maybe they had read about it in some newspaper, but that's what was going on in America. World War I ends up being a very important turning point for Jewish thought. And that's sort of where I wanted to start and why I think this class in particular was so difficult to think up, because the 1800s through World War I, you could almost imagine, despite, obviously things like Protocols of Elders of Zion and the Dreyfus affairs that we spoke about in the past, life was generally getting better for Jews between the year 1800 and let's call it 1914 or 1915. And so for that 120-ish years, Jewish thinkers only became more and more optimistic in terms of what they could expect for the future of life in the diaspora. And again, this is still at a time when most Jews are living in Western Europe, although by the time World War I outbroke, already millions of Jews had migrated from Eastern Europe to the United States of America, which very much makes up the bulk of the American Jewish population. But at least in Western Europe, again, putting the Zionists to the side because they were very much a minority, the mainstream view is that more integration, things are getting better. We talked about Mendelssohn, we talked about Avram Geiger, we talked about Zacharias Frankel, we talked about Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. What these thinkers all shared in common was optimism towards the future, right? They disagreed on how they would classify Judaism, but they were all optimistic about Western Europe working out as a place for the Jewish people. After World War I, or really when World War I starts, this becomes very much not obvious anymore. It's not taken for granted. There were many Jews that were conscripted to fight for a variety of Western European countries in World War I, and very quickly, Jews understood that the old stereotypes against them had never really went away. And so I wanted to start today with actually a text that we don't usually think of Franz Kafka as a Jewish thinker, but he is Jewish. He was modern, right? He was writing in Germany in the early to mid 1900s, right around the time of World War I. And so Kafka very much, could in theory be positioned as a thinker talking about the Jewish condition. And one of his most famous short stories, we're not going to read it all, we'll just read the first couple of lines, The Metamorphosis, has been taken almost unanimously by scholars to be talking about anti-Semitism and the Jewish condition in Germany. So we'll read the first paragraph, I'll summarize the rest of it, and then we can discuss, and then we'll get into some of our Jewish thinkers here. But just to paint a little bit of the history. So Metamorphosis is very short. You can find it for free online. Highly recommend that everybody gives this a read if they haven't. But it starts off in a room, and as Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a giant insect. He was lying on his hard as if it was armor plated back. And when he lifted his head a little, he can see his dome-like belly brown, divided into stiff, arched segments, on top of which the bed quilt could hardly keep in position and was about to slide off completely. His numerous legs which were pitifully thin compared to the rest of his bulk, waved helplessly before his eyes. What has happened to me, he thought. It was no dream. His room, a regular human bedroom, only rather too small, lay quiet between the four familiar walls. So he goes on, and if you've never read The Metamorphosis, just to summarize, it's a little bit of a spoiler alert, but it came out 110 years ago, so you've had time. The Metamorphosis is describing this situation where this guy, Gregory, wakes up in a room. He has no idea what happened to him, but he's turned into a giant insect. And then, of course, his family freaks out, and the entire thing is about how his family is trying to distance himself and lock him in his room. And then finally, at the end of the story, Gregory dies and his family breathes a sigh of relief and they go off living their life like normal, right? This fascinating metaphor, and it could be talking about many things. There's been some scholars who have thought, maybe the Metamorphosis is talking about if somebody, a good friend or family member has a critical illness or disease and the toll that it takes on family, right? So there are other ways to read the Metamorphosis, but the most common way is, of course, to talk about anti-Semitism, right? Franz Kafka was a German Jew, highly educated in Germany. He's writing the Metamorphosis in 1914, right? The year that World War I, or 1915, right as World War I breaks out, right as Jews are starting to be seen as different and bad. And the way in which he describes in Metamorphosis, it's almost like you wake up one day and you're an insect and all of society, is looking at you with, at best, they don't want to have anything to do with you. At worst, they're trying to exterminate you. And very much speaking this language, again, we oftentimes, when we think of Jews as insects and them trying to be exterminated, we immediately think of Hitler, who, of course, wouldn't rise to power till 20 years later. But now we're sort of entering into the chapter in modern Jewish thought where the optimism that pervaded the 1800s or even 1700s, starting with Mendelssohn that we talked about, sort of comes to a sliding halt. And after World War I, just to fill in the history, and then we'll talk about how Jewish thought ends up taking a big turn, because one of the things that happens is many Jewish movements, right? We call today's class Jewish existentialism. And just to paint a little bit of the background, existentialism usually refers to the questions of individual existence. So questions of yourself and your place in the world and your place in the cosmos and, what is right and what is wrong. And, but it's all about centering around, you, your individual, and oftentimes your subjective experience. That's very different than the Jewish thought we were talking about in the 1800s that generally dealt with the community and politics and social norms. And so Jewish thinkers after World War I, they turned inward, right? They stopped focusing on the big external things in terms of their philosophy. And thinkers like Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig and Joseph Soloveitchik, amidst many others, within their writings, they're talking about relationships. They're talking about the individual. They're no longer talking about these sort of grand plans for, reforming Judaism or historical criticism Judaism or, defending the halachic tradition, right? It's almost as if, these conversations were certainly still happening, but the zeitgeist, right, to use another German word, right, the atmosphere of the time was very much, conducive to Jews turning inward because of a lot of the socio-political situation that was happening. At the same time, and I'll throw one more thing out just by, very general. I know this is past an introduction, but to end the history segment, it's after World War I that the Jewish world undergoes a massive shift in favor of Zionism. And so I gave this example before that if you pop into a synagogue in 1902 anywhere in America, chances are they would have been anti-Zionist. By the time the 1920s roll around, the reform movement officially changes its platform to being on board with Zionism. The American Jewish community ends up mobilizing and raising an incredible amount of money for the Zionist project in British Mandate Palestine. And this is because, again, the increase of anti-Semitism in World War I mixed with the fact that open immigration to America was no longer an option, right? Between 1881 and 1914, about 2.5 million Jews came from Europe to America, right? Many of our grandparents or great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents, I imagine. After World War I, in 1924, I believe, all of a sudden, borders are closed. And now there's very strict quotas on who can immigrate. And this was coinciding with a period of American Jewish history where anti-Semitism also increased, right? This is when you had people like the preacher Charles Coughlin or Henry Ford, who was, the Elon Musk of the time, the most widespread and one of the most celebrated, business moguls out there. And so you had really loud voices within the American mainstream pushing a pervasive anti-Semitism that ended off resulting in very few Jews being able to immigrate between the 1920s and really until post-Holocaust. People always ask me, this is a total tangent, but it's a question I get a lot from especially people outside the Jewish community, where they say, I mean, there's a lot of implication in this question, but I'll just give the question as flat out as possible. And they say, why do Jews tend to be so liberal in terms of their voting patterns in America? And there's probably many answers to give, but I think the most historically accurate answer is the closing of the borders in 1920 and how much that hurt Jews. And that was, obviously being done by Republicans. And so for 100 years, many Jews had this sort of knee-jerk reaction of, of course we need to side with, Democrats and liberal parties and everything there. But all that is to say, all of these questions were in, full-blown questions. The other thing, and where I wanted to start, because we started off last week talking about Messianism and Zionism. And just to rehash a little bit of what we did last week, and then we'll do one source and we can take some questions, is many of the anti-Zionists, again, before World War I in Germany, were looking at the Zionists and they were accusing Zionists of giving up on Messianism, right? And in their eyes, and we read, Hermann Cohen, we read Franz Rosenzweig a little bit, where they said, the beauty of Judaism is that we have this universalistic goal of uniting the world. And the only way to do that is if you're actually engaged in the world. If we all coop up in one, tiny piece of real estate in the Middle East, this is going to be very hard to usher in the Messianic period. And we saw Franz Rosenzweig, and I'll share my screen for 1 second so we can see what Rosenzweig says. This is probably one of his most famous conceptions of the Jewish people. We talked about this a little bit last week, but he paints the Jews as a timeless and historicalist people. So what he says is, the true eternity of the eternal people must always be alien and vexing to the state and to the history of the world. In the epochs of world history, the state wields its sharp sword and carves hours of eternity in the bark of the growing tree of life, while the eternal people, untroubled and untouched year after year, adds ring upon ring to the stem of its eternal life. And so Rosenzweig is specifically saying that if Jews have a timeless mission, that means that Jews can't be bound to any concrete anything, right? No banality of nation states, no bureaucracy, no military, no weapons. Again, it's a very idealistic portrayal of Judaism. And we spoke last week how obviously many people pushed back and said, you can't be so idealistic as if to, I don't know, forget to pay your electricity bill and your water bill and, eventually your house gets foreclosed on because you're living, above time and above money. And so that was sort of the main criticism that Rosenzweig was given for this idea of Jews being the timeless people. But you had this debate where many people who were taking the sort of religious side of Judaism, and I'm using religious very broad. Religious can mean ultra-Orthodox, and religious can mean religious non-Orthodox, right? Franz Rosenzweig was deeply religious. He didn't really identify as an Orthodox Jew, all the way to Reform Jews who were, again, religious, right? If you're a Reform Jew, you are religious, but you might be an antinomian. You might not practice Jewish law. They all agreed that Zionism constituted an attack on the religion of Judaism, right? This is something interesting. And so if you got a ultra-Orthodox Jew, a Reform Jew, and a conservative Jew all in a room in 1910 in Berlin, and you were talking about Zionism, they would all say in some way Zionism is an attack on religious Judaism. Now, whether or not we think they're right or not is sort of irrelevant for the point today. Is Abraham Isaac Cook, who possibly, at least at this point, was one of the most important thinkers of the 20th century in the Jewish world. Again, during his time, very few people had really heard of him because he did something that was crazy. He was a part of many of the top yeshivot in Central and Eastern Europe. And so he was offered a position to be one of the head rabbis. So you imagine you're you're a scholar and you are offered the opportunity to be the head of, I don't know, Yale or Harvard or Columbia, a top university. And instead, Rav Kook got on a boat and sailed to Jaffa in 1904, right? Something you need to know about Jaffa in 1904. This is before the British Mandate period. This is when Tel Aviv still constituted, sand dunes. So there was virtually no infrastructure to take up a position of the rabbi of the Jaffa, eventual Tel Aviv area. Eventually, we know Kook became the first chief rabbi of Israel. And what Rav Kook does, which the reason why I think he's one of the most important Jewish thinkers of the 20th century, is he completely changed the way that many in the state of Israel, and by extension in the American religious community, see the land of Israel, which is Israel itself is a source of messianism, right? So you had all the debates that we talked about last week. Is Zionism giving up on messianism? Martin Buber, that we saw at the end of class last week, says, listen, if Jews are going to bring about the Messiah, we still need to keep Jews alive in order for them to do it. So he was sort of a pragmatic Zionist, but Rav Kook explicitly comes in and he writes, in many different places, but here is Rav Kook, and then we can discuss this idea. He says, secular Zionists may think they do it for political, national, or socialist reasons, but in fact, the actual reason for them coming to resettle in Israel is a religious Jewish spark in their soul, planted by God. Without their knowledge, they are contributing to the divine scheme and actually committing a great mitzvah. The role of religious Zionists is to help them establish a Jewish state and turn the religious spark in them into a great light. They should show them that the real source of Zionism and the longed-for Zion is Judaism, and teach them the Torah with love and kindness. In the end, they will understand that the laws of Torah are the key to true harmony and a socialist state that will be a light for the nations and bring salvation to the world. And so it is impossible, by the way, to understand contemporary Israel. Again, I know we're not really talking about contemporary Israel, but the philosophies that make up contemporary Israel without understanding Rav Kook and his influence. Because he takes Zionism from a thing that was at best a-religious. In other words, the religious axes of Judaism and the Zionistic axes of Judaism were just different axes. And so one can imagine you can be a Zionist and not religious. You can be a religious person and not a Zionist. You can be a religious person and a Zionist, but those philosophies never really intersected. And Rav Kook explicitly says these two goals are one and the same, right? If the goal of Judaism, again, Rav Kook was a part of a Hasidic dynasty, and we've talked a little bit about Hasidism before and Hasidic Judaism. Hasidic Judaism all revolved around the idea of bringing about the Mashiach and bringing about the Messiah, left over from, late Kabbalah from the city of Tzfat with Isaac Luria. I think we talked about this the first class. If not, happy to answer any and all questions about it. And so the goal of all Hasidic groups was and still is to bring about the Messiah as quick as possible, right? But then there's this question, how do you do it, right? I'm sure everyone here is familiar with Chabad, right? Chabad's probably the most publicly facing Hasidic group. And so the way that Chabad believes you bring about the Messiah is performing as many mitzvot as possible. And you can imagine, every time you do a mitzvah, you're dropping a drop of water into, this giant vessel. And when the vessel reaches the top, Mashiach comes. And so they'll go in public and try to wrap tefillin on any Jewish male they can find and give Shabbat candles to anyone they can find, right? Because this is how you bring about the Messiah. What Rav Kook brought forth in his philosophy was, well, the way in which you bring about the Messiah is when the Jewish people are reconnected in their ancestral homeland. And this means bringing Jews to Israel, and it means Jews being in control of Israel, right? And so it's not hard to see how these philosophies ended up becoming enormously popular. There's a lot to say about this. I don't want to get down too much of a rabbit hole with modern political debate in Israel, but just one example in which Rav Kook's philosophy really changed the trajectory of Israel is after the Six-Day War in 1967, when Israel all of a sudden possesses the historic areas of Yehuda v'Shomron, or Judea and Samaria, otherwise known as the West Bank. Many in the labor camp, right? This is the, secular Zionist camp, that were thinking like Theodor Herzl, right? Herzl had long been dead, but the, Herzlian Zionists who were pragmatic, right? Where their brand of Zionism, right? We read Herzl 2 weeks ago, were Jews just need a state. We just need to be able to protect ourselves. We need an army. We need a police force. We need borders. The Herzlian Zionists said, great, we have new land. What a great opportunity to trade that land away for peace, right? Because again, in Herzl's mind, the exact contours of the borders of Israel were slightly irrelevant, right? What was important for Herzlian Zionists is that there is a Jewish state, that Jews control the public sphere, right? What, according to a Rav Kook mindset, though, if you are in control of places like Hebron or East Jerusalem or Shiloh, right? Places that are very ubiquitous within the Bible and Jewish tradition, you better believe you have to hold on to that and keep it. And so the major debate in Israel that in some way is still around, but between, 1967 and we'll call it, 2000 or 2005 with the Second Intifada, was the religious Zionists versus the Herzlian Zionists in terms of how to understand Israel and the entity of Israel. Is Israel a religious value? Is Israel a secular value that has nothing to do with religious? All the way to many conversations that are way beyond the scope of what we're hoping to talk about in the next 30 minutes, which is even debates about the public sphere in Israel, right? So should buses run on Shabbat? Should, do hospitals need to serve kosher food on Passover? Are people allowed to pray egalitarian at the Western Wall, right? All these big hot button issues, right? In some way, they can be traced back to some sort of this debate of, is the state of Israel itself a religious entity and religious value within Judaism? Or is it sort of, tangential to religious, right? It, maybe yes, maybe no, but we're not going to place a specific religious value. And that was what Rav Kook brought to conversations of Zionism in the Jewish world. Last thing I'll say, then I'll take some thoughts and questions. After Rav Kook, made it kosher to be a religious Jew and a Zionist. And the history of, Zionism catching on in the Orthodox community, yes, the ultra-Orthodox, still have, they're not very Zionistic, shall we say, but every year that's changing. And the Orthodox community, and I'm talking even ultra-Orthodox community, every year is becoming more and more on board with Zionism the longer Zionism lasts. There's a lot to say about that, but that goes back to the teachings of Abraham Isaac Kook. All right, pause for any and all thoughts or questions. Then we'll talk a little bit about Jewish existentialism. Okay, amazing. So I painted this a little bit before, but a lot of Jewish thinkers turned inward post World War I. I'll give a couple examples, and we can read one or two texts. James, did you have a question?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go for it. Wait, you're on mute. You're still on mute.
The decision to use Hebrew as a language, how did that play into Zionism and seeing the Jewish state as what it is?
Yeah, it's really interesting. This is one of the most fun episodes of Jewish history. There was actually something called the Language Wars, Milchamot HaSifaot in Hebrew. And there were two camps in early Zionism. This is, even tangential to the religious aspect, but there was one camp very much led by Herzl. Herzl was very against Hebrew, right? Herzl actually wrote an essay. It's a funny essay because it's so wrong, but it's an essay where he says, can you imagine something more ridiculous than somebody being able to order a train ticket in Hebrew, right? Because for Herzl, Hebrew was the language of, the Bible and the language that you prayed in synagogue and the language of the Mishnah, but there's no trains in the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah was 1800 years ago. And so Herzl very much believed that, Hebrew would be impossible. Many of the cultural Zionists, right? So we talked about Echad Ha'am and Asher Ginsburg 2 weeks ago. And the view of Echad Ha'am was that Herzl may have been correct in the importance of a political entity to protect Jews, but Herzl forgot one big thing, which is Judaism. And so Echad Ha'am attempted to bring in Jewish culture, not necessarily religious Judaism, there's a distinction, but Jewish culture, right? The state of Israel needs public Jewish symbols. So instead of just, someone drawing something, the emblem of the state of Israel will be the menorah, right? A historic Jewish symbol, right? So Hebrew very much entered this debate because many of the cultural Zionists believed, okay, this is a Jewish state. We need a Jewish language, right? We need to, reinvent Hebrew. The problem is no one has spoken really Hebrew for a very long time. The sort of a classic or, apocryphal story, which seems to actually be quite true, is that there was a man, Eliezer ben Yehuda, who was an early Zionist. If you've ever been to Israel, a third of the streets are named after him. So, If you ever lost, just ask for Ben Yehuda Street. It's usually the street in the busiest downtown area in both Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and other cities. Ben Yehuda was a early adopter of cultural Zionism, and the story goes that he wrote, the first dictionary and everything like that. But he raised his two children with the first language of Hebrew when they were the only two people in the world that had spoken Hebrew at the time. So this was like this crazy experiment, right? One can debate whether or not this is, constitutes some sort of child abuse or anything not. But he starts to, reemerge this language of Hebrew. And then in the 1910s, there's two camps in Israel. There's the Yiddishists and the Hebraists, and they both had, competing newspapers, and they both had competing schools, and they were arguing for, which language should Israel adopt, which language should, Hebrew University adopt. And I believe, the reason why it became called the language wars was because there were a couple times where acts of overt vandalism would actually outbreak between the two camps. I believe the worst thing that happened was the Hebrew side firebombed the production line of a Yiddish newspaper somewhere in Israel. I'm forgetting the details. You can look it up. But these two, this was not like, friendly, oh, so you speak Yiddish, I speak Hebrew. This was, a strong ideological battle for, what the future of Israel is going to be. And one way to think of this debate, it's interesting, Israel's still kind of torn, by the way. Not between Yiddish and Hebrew, but I'll give an example. If you've noticed, if you ever turn on, international sports or international music competitions like Eurovision, Israel's in, Eurovision. And we actually have a UCI student now. She's playing for the Israel national basketball team. It's a European tournament. And so in some way, there's the half of Israel that is clinging to its European connections and origins. And this was very much Herzl, right? Herzl was a socialist. Herzl very much, was trying to build the Europe in the Middle East, right? That was his goal. You then have other Zionists, right, very much who are saying, no, Israel is not, European, and it's not Western, right? It's sort of, historically Jewish and sui generis. Again, it doesn't have to be a binary. We can admit that Israel has European elements while also being Jewish, but this Yiddish-Hebrew debate was very much along these lines of the cultural Zionists, very much, a la Eliezer ben Yehuda, and even more so the religious Zionists, were levying the argument of, hey, if we are building a homeland, this can't be just an extension of, some European Jews who have a good idea for Judaism. This is a fundamental different thing, like give up on Europe, essentially. Whereas other people were still, even Herzl was very partial. And, same with other early Zionists. Chaim Weizmann, right? We can talk about him in this way. They cared a lot, and Ben Gurion, I believe also, they cared a lot what the West, and by the West I mean Europe, had to say about them. And you have these two groups in Israel as well, right? If the EU or the UN or France or, Italy says something about Israel today, you have some people in Israel that, very much care to be loved by the EU. And you have other people, nowadays the majority is the other people who say, who cares what the EU has to do? We don't care about the EU. Why are you bothering us with the EU and the UN? And so I think the Yiddish Hebrew debate can be very much understood along those lines of, is this a Jewish European project, or is this a, different project? So I love the question. Any other questions or anything before we get into some Jewish existentialism? Go for it, Rhea.
So I understand that Odessa was a center for Hebrew, that there was people from other areas of Eastern Europe would go, boys, men, not women, would go to Odessa, and there were a lot of schools, and Hebrew was the center of the Jewish community in Odessa. Is that accurate, or is that somewhat accurate? So that it's not just in Israel or the future Israel that Hebrew was being developed, but it was a very strong movement in the Odessa Jewish community.
Yeah, 100%. So during the Haskalah, I sort of, this is the thing no one really tells us about Eliezer ben Yehuda. During the Haskalah, sorry, there we go. Sorry, I don't know why I froze for a sec. There we go. Okay. During the Haskalah, some maskilim try to write in Hebrew. I mean, not tried. They wrote in Hebrew. They wrote poems in Hebrew. So there already was, it's a little bit wrong, and I, said the thing that's a little bit wrong, so I will apologize, that Hebrew essentially was dead for 1800 years. There's sort of two good historic contrary. One is actually medieval Spain. And so a lot of poetry that we have and, famous songs, everyone here is probably familiar with the poem Adon Olam, right? We sing it all the time, right? Adon Olam was written in medieval Spain by a rabbi named Ibn Gabirol, right? He was a Jewish Neoplatonist. And so this was, there was a period of, where Jews were trying to reclaim Hebrew as a cultural productive language. And the same thing during the Haskalah in, a lot of centers, some in Eastern Europe like Odessa, others in Western Europe, where people were thinking, were writing in Hebrew in the 1800s. I believe, and, somebody can fact check me because I'm not 100% sure of what I'm about to say. It still was not spoken. And so, what I think happened was that because Jewish texts, historic Jewish texts, are all written in Hebrew, it was a lot easier to convert biblical or rabbinic Hebrew into literature than it was to speak, because when you write, it's a lot less nuanced in some way, right? You can kind of narrow in, but creating a language that you can speak in, I mean, even Hebrew now, it's sort of like comedic how many English words there are and how many European words there are. And, the modern Hebrew is sort of a mishmash of biblical Hebrew, Yiddish, and 6 other languages, sort of repackaged. So I think that was sort of the genius of Ben Yehuda. Not that like he opened, dusted off some relics and nobody had ever heard, a Hebrew sentence for hundreds of years. So I think you're right. But I think, again, it still was, nobody had thought to speak this language. And then, of course, in the ultra-Orthodox community, this is sort of another fun tidbit as well. There was this idea that Hebrew is too holy to be spoken in non-holy places. And so this is still true in some ultra-Orthodox communities. And it's one of the reasons why even in Israel, in ultra-Orthodox communities, the language will be Yiddish, and there'll be actually a refusal to speak Hebrew. Some of it has to do with not wanting to acculturate, fine, but some of it is also because of, well, Hebrew is the language that you pray in and that the Torah is written in, not the language that, to go back and quote Herzl, you order a coffee in, right? And so there were all sorts of tensions around Hebrew as well. So, but yeah, you're 100% right. Okay, so I want to, in the next 20 minutes, just talk a little bit about some other movements that popped up. And again, this is also primarily Germany to America. And like I said before, especially post-World War I, a lot of Jewish life began to turn more towards the existential, inward, more subjective relationship with Judaism, other people, God, space, in general. Martin Buber is probably, the most famous to come out of this era. The most famous because, ironically, if you ever want to make it really famous as a Jewish thinker, you have to write something that's going to be read by Protestants, right? This is sort of a long-time Jewish advice, because Martin Buber, when he writes his famous magnum opus called I Am Thou, in the Jewish world, its reception is actually a little shaky. And many people love to attack his book, I Am Thou. I'll talk about what the book is in a second, because you can discuss at home, whether correctly or incorrectly, point out that it doesn't seem very Jewish, right? There's not much Judaic content to it, even though he's writing it obviously as a Jewish thinker, whereas it seems to be a lot more Protestant-like in its thought. So we'll read a little bit from Martin Buber, and then I'll discuss a little bit more about Martin Buber, because he was quite an interesting figure. So he writes this book called I Am Thou, where he divides he makes a couple of claims. One, his premise of the book is that the most important thing that we have is relationships. Relationship to ourselves, relationships to other people, and eventually relationships to God. But that the only way to make meaning in life is through relationships, right? This is, part of the existentialism, right? How do you exist as a person and create meaning? Buber's answer is you create meaning through relationship, right? That's sort of his grand premise that ties all his philosophy. He then divides relationship into two categories. And he says the vast majority of our relationships are what he calls I-it, right? I-it relationships are exactly what they sound like, right? You are subject or objectifying somebody, right? An it is an object, right? So I have my coffee cup here. I relate to this coffee cup as an it, right? This serves a functional purpose, right? If my coffee cup, started leaking coffee and, the glass broke, I would probably throw it out and get a new coffee cup because, it no longer serves my purpose. And what Buber offers is he says the vast majority of the time that we go through life and relate to the other, right, another person or even God, it is as an I-it relationship, right? If I'm in a relationship with you, it is what can you do for me, or how can I benefit my social status by talking to you, or how can I make myself feel better, right? All of the things that we can imagine. And he says the goal, the real meaning of life is to be found in I-thou relationships, right? This is sort of the gold standard of meaning making. And I-thou is not just a demeanor that should be between people, but ultimately the ultimate I-thou relationship in the universe that is possible is yourself and God, but not within a relationship that is constantly saying, well, I'm praying for this, I want this, but just in full relationship. And just to read a little bit, his writing is very, poetically dense. So, it's kind of hard to take, if we took 2 pages, I think you'd probably all close your computers. But just to read a little bit, he says, I-thou can only be spoken with the whole being. It can never be spoken with the whole being. It has a substance and only exists through being bounded by others. Thou has no substance and knows no bounds, but takes a stand in relation. The world of experience belongs to it. I-thou establishes the world of relation. And so Buber holds up relationship as the pinnacle religious value, right? A relationship by definition can, has no substance, right? There's nothing concrete there. There's no ask, there's no reciprocity, there's no desire to gain anything or anything there. It's just simply in that relationship. He spends, dozens of pages describing, how one can do this, and then eventually he switches his theology to not just focusing on the individual, but then focusing on human relationship to God. What's interesting about Buber, so this sounds, and I'll unshare my screen for a second, and then we'll have to get to Rav Soloveitchik before we finish. So I'll do one more text here. Buber's philosophy, on the one hand, sounds very unorthodox, right? A-traditional, because classical Jewish tradition, at least if you take the Orthodox approach, it's about, concrete action and doing the commandments. And, we don't spend a lot of time in Judaism talking about the foundational relationship between me and another person and me and God that's untethered by anything. So Buber does 2 things that are interesting. One, he gives an entire commentary to the Tanakh, or he also translated it, but he comments on it. And his entire commentary centered around his argument that the Torah, if read properly, could be understood as a I-thou relationship. That's one. The more interesting thing that Buber did for the legacy of Jewish thought is he was the first non-Hasidic Jew to take a deep, passionate, and religious interest in Hasidism. He publishes a story called Tales of the Hasidim. And this is the first time that anyone outside of the Hasidic community is interested in Hasidic Judaism, right? Again, we talked about Hasidic Judaism a few weeks ago. It was an Eastern European movement. Hasidic Judaism didn't really make it to Western Europe, right? It didn't make it yet really to America. By the year 1900, it barely made it to, what would eventually become the state of Israel. And Buber finds ideas within Hasidism to back up his idea that subjective relational experience is the pinnacle of Jewish thought. Now, this is, on the one hand, seems a little crazy because today we think of Hasidic Jews as the most dogmatically orthodox, ritual-centric, Jews that are around. But we spoke about the Hasidic movement a couple weeks ago, and the Hasidic movement in some way could be viewed as its own reformation of Judaism. The Hasidic movement was specifically came around because the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidic Judaism in the 1700s, looked around and saw a bunch of Jews just robotically practicing Judaism, and he realized, hey, we need to excite people with more of the subjective religious experience. So he instituted songs and dance and sometimes drinking, right? All things that are, you'll get if you go to a Hasidic home for Shabbat. You better believe you're going to be singing and clapping your hands and dancing and drinking, right? There's no line in the Torah where God says, thou shalt dance around your room Friday night, a little bit drunk on wine, singing songs. That's not that's not how the Torah says to celebrate Shabbat. But the Hasidic rabbis understood that if you want someone to have a deep Jewish experience, you have to care about the subjective experience, not the objective. So Buber brings the Hasidic tradition to defend his thesis, I thou, that Judaism is about these subjective relational experiences from one person to another or from one person to God. And he essentially, repopularizes Hasidic Judaism, so much so that, Gershom Scholem, who I've mentioned many times, a sort of, scholar of Jewish mysticism, he disagrees with a lot of Buber's classifications, but he writes at the beginning of his book, that he's indebted to Buber because, again, nobody had even thought to translate these, these Hasidic works were written in Yiddish in the early 1800s, and, no one would have thought that anybody would have been interested in these ideas. And we fast forward to today, again, when we think of the legacy, because, even if very few people have necessarily, read the book I Thou, even though, the footnote is that it is still a very popularly read book. It's still, I believe, I saw the statistic somewhere. I don't know if it's true or not. So take it with as much of a grain of salt as you would from any other statistic you randomly find on the internet. Somebody said that I and Thou was the most read book on Jewish philosophy that exists, mostly because it became very popular in liberal Christian circles as well. So I don't know if that's true, but it became very popular. But within the Jewish sphere, where most Jews have never read I and Thou, right? I mean, I grew up, I never even heard of the book until I got to college, growing up in an Orthodox community. But the idea of bringing in Hasidic practice, or what we might call neo-Hasidic Judaism, or what some call Jewish renewal, or even just the fact that now across a wide array of Jewish denominations, it's very common to speak about Jewish experience in the subjective of the, happiness and relationship and the singing and dancing and all things that seem kind of Hasidic. Buber was essentially the vehicle of those ideas from, the Eastern Europe shtetl to, homes and communities across places like Orange County, California, or Jerusalem, Israel, which these ideas are also becoming incredibly popular. So Buber's a fascinating thinker. We talked a little bit last week also about how he was also an early proponent of Zionism as well. So Buber very much tries to unite all these worlds, right? Western Europe and Eastern Europe, Zionism and Jewish liberalism, to some extent, even Christianity and Judaism. And so fascinating thinker. I'll pause for a few minutes to see if there's any thoughts or questions about him. This is, again, one of those topics where we could spend, 3 days just talking about Buber, and instead we allocated a third of a class to him. But if this excites people and makes people want to read more, that is obviously the goal. So any and all questions.
I have a question, Daniel.
Yeah.
Um, I remember that years ago, and Ria might remember this too, in one of the early years of Community Scholars Program, one of the month-long scholars was from Boston University. I want to say it was Martin Katz, who is a renowned sort of scholar of Hasidic literature, and he talked about Buber's relationship to Hasidism and the Hasidic tales that he translated. But he said that they were adapted, and certain things were like certain qualities were left out, so to sort of fit into a rubric I mean, I'm really going back 20 years almost. It's hard to remember, but is there in his embrace of Hasidism and Hasidic tales, was there a was there an not an edge, but was there something that he adapted to work within the framework of life that he operated under and not really in the Hasidic world itself? I guess I don't know if I'm asking the right question, but I just remember being fascinated by that and not studying it any further. And if I wanted to learn more about that, where would you recommend I go?
Yes. So you're 100% right. Good memory. Gershom Scholem, who is, really the first stop shop for all things, Hasidic or Kabbalah. He again, felt very indebted to Buber, but he writes that Buber, I think this is a quote. He says he like overly fetishizes, and he writes the Hasidim as if it's spiritual poetry. In other words, his complaint, and not complaint, his criticism was that Buber was not approaching the Hasidim as history, but was using them as sort of a polemic, right? And Buber might have actually agreed. In other words, Hasidic Judaism is based off of very concrete views about God and the world and the Torah and everything there. What Buber did, you're 100% right, is essentially say, well, they didn't really believe in a lot of the like more folklorish aspects of, angels and God, God in a very specific, imminent way that the Hasidic rabbis talk about. It's kind of metaphorical and poetic, but really what they were talking about was this subjective experience of, coming across God in all these incredible ways. So, you have these stories of the Baal Shem Tov that he would, descend and, talk amongst angels. And, if you've ever read Hasidic stories, there's a lot of this. Or, a rabbi goes down into a well and has a conversation with Mashiach and, says, when are you going to come? And so what Gershom Sholem alleges is that these stories not necessarily would have been believed 100% as factual truth, but they do reflect folklorish beliefs that many Eastern European Jews would have actually had. What Buber does is essentially he says, well, this was just them describing a subjective experience, the same way if I get hit in the head and I say there are stars, I saw stars, everyone knows I'm not literally talking about that. So Buber kind of like, not sanitizes, but he interprets the Hasidic movement from being about deep folklorish dogmatic beliefs to being a sort of like, look, it's all about the subjective experience and, everyone sees God a different way. I think they're both right, meaning, if you're a historian, if you're a question, which Gershom Sholem's question was, which is who actually were the Hasidim, right? Like you're in a history class. Buber's probably wrong, historically speaking, but in terms of, but Jews have always reinterpreted, right? The rabbis were also probably wrong when they interpreted the Torah in certain ways, they're giving interpretations, and this is what creates unfolding Judaism. This is why, there's always been a little bit of tension between Jewish historians and Jewish thinkers, because the thinkers are trying to talk about ideas and historians are trying to talk about, well, what actually happened. And so, but it's a fascinating debate. I don't remember where. So Gershom Sholem has an entire chapter about Martin Buber's interpretation of the Hasidim. If I can find it in the next 3 seconds, I'll put the link in the chat.
Don't worry about it. I'll look for that. I mean, or you and I can talk about it later. But thank you. That really, really helpful.
Perfect. Yeah. And I did find it in the last 3 seconds. So I'll just put it in the chat. I think this is the article. Yeah, this is it. So if you want to read the article, fascinating article. Rhea, go for it. You're on mute.
Whoops. Okay. So that when a non-Jew, I had a friend who always asked, what do the Jews believe in X? And I would say, well, if you look at this, if you look at that and all that sort of stuff. So because we have no catechism, we do not have the head of, we don't have a pope giving out encyclicals or whatever. And so there's all kinds of ways that we've developed in interpreting life and the connection to our relationship to God and all the rest of that stuff. And so that's where I believe that that Martin Buber goes and cleans it up and not cleans it up, but puts it in a very smaller package. So I have not Gershom Scholem I don't know anything about. So that's what I have to look at with his critique of Martin Buber.
Yeah, I think that's I think it's totally right. And I think also their projects were different in terms. I mean, Buber and they were both very successful. I'll also point that out is they both got out what they needed. But you're right. There's no. I mean, in some way, I'm reminded there's another funny episode in American Jewish history. where there was an attempt to create an American chief rabbi. We can all imagine how well that went, right? And so it's just like part of Jewish life, which is part of the fun, is that there is no central council of people who decide these things. Which is why we have so many different ideas that have populated the Jewish world, and yeah, I mean, again, in some way, it's funny because Gershom Scholem, I think Freud called it, right, like the narcissism of small differences. It's like you're really upset when somebody's almost always the same, but like a tiny bit different, as opposed to if someone's completely different. I mean, Martin Buber and Gershom Scholem, probably the two of them did more for the popularity of Hasidic Judaism than like any other Jew maybe in history. And, it's funny that they had so much tension around the interpretations, but I think that's also the exact point, is that, they both cared so much about this.
Well, let me.
I,
So let me I'm
yeah,
sorry.
go for it.
I know you have to. I just. So how does the proliferation of Chabad worldwide also impact the popularity of Hasidism? Because even though Chabad, I mean that is a sect of Hasidism, and would that have happened with or without Gershom Scholem and Martin Buber?
Probably. I think Chabad ends up being a somewhat, unique branch of Hasidism because of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. I mean, the last Lubavitcher Rebbe. I mean, he had such an incredible idea to understand Jewish sociology. I mean, it's hard to put it in a starker term, is this unique period post-Holocaust when the Jewish world was sort of still in disarray and rebuilding and trying to figure out, what it, who it is, what it's going to do. I mean, we haven't even touched post-Holocaust Jewish thought in this series, because in some way, most Jewish historians classify post-Holocaust era as like the postmodern period. It's like, after the Holocaust, Jews completely give up on a lot of these conversations. I mean, not give up, but like all these conversations of modernity crumble, and, there's as many branches of Judaism as, stars in the sky. But Chabad, I think, the Lubavitcher Rebbe had a unique ability to understand the sociology of the Jewish world post-Holocaust, and especially in America and Israel. It's becoming more popular, but that was recent. That was, I mean, if you would have told, I just recorded a podcast. I mentioned this before with an American Jewish historian, and we both kind of mentioned, if 45 years ago you told anyone in the Jewish world that Chabad would be everywhere, on every campus, on every suburban city, and every teen program, summer camps, they would have thought you were crazy. Because if I told you now that Satmar would be, running every Jewish institution, you'd also laugh. You're like, okay, Satmar, they're kind of, I've never even met a Satmar Chassid. I mean, there's more Satmar Chassids than Chabadniks in the world. And so I think they're sort of separate. Although I'm not sure. I mean, I'm sure you could probably complicate it a little bit. But what I will say is the bringing in of the Kabbalistic Hasidic tradition into the non-Hasidic world. So this is everybody from people like Shlomo Carlebach, who was a very influential Orthodox, non-Hasidic, but like, musician who, many of the tunes that are used all throughout the Jewish world for Kabbalat Shabbat or, Shalom Aleichem are written by Shlomo Carlebach, all the way to like, when people talk about Jewish summer camps, whether it's Orthodox, Reform, or Conservative, they talk about like the spirituality and singing and everything there. That's not quite the same thing as, bringing an organ into the synagogue in the 1800s to play very, high-minded, piano during services, right? It's very different, the sort of very, I'll use a Hasidic word, like a very Hamish, a very homey feeling of sitting in a circle, there's drums, someone has a guitar, we have our arms around each other, we're saying Havdalah together, everybody's super into it because we have the fire and, everything there. That I do think is because of the Hasidic tradition that was sort of pushed, not in a negative way, but like, but pushed onto the rest of the Jewish community through a lot of these vehicles. Today, it's probably impossible to say like what's Chabad's influence, what's Buber and Shalom's influence, what's just general, the hippie movement of the 60s and 70s influence. And so it's probably a more tough job now. But Buber's writing in I think this is 1920 something, where he puts out, or maybe even 1910s, where he puts out Tales of the Hasidim. And that was like completely weird. And maybe I'll end with this, and we'll start with Soloveitchik next week. Maybe that'll be a good way to, start to conclude the class of Soloveitchik, because he was really the only post-Holocaust figure that we're going to deal with extensively, is before Buber and really Sholem, the high-minded intellectual Jewish thing to do was to ignore the Hasidic movement. I think I probably mentioned this before, but they were embarrassed by it because here were the, Jewish German intellectuals. They were trying to make Judaism into this very intellectual monotheistic tradition that could compete with the most rationalist forms of Protestantism. And over there in Eastern Europe, you have these Hasidic Jews that are running around talking about angels and talking about possessions and having amulets, right? One thing no one ever tells us about Jewish history is that amulets were incredibly popular. You had amulets for everything. I mean, we have the mezuzah still, but like, on baby cribs, there'd be amulets. And if someone got sick, you'd write them an amulet. And this would all be some, there's no tradition in the Torah to write amulets. The Talmud deals with it a little bit, but it's really the, Eastern Europe, the European Jewish tradition that talks about this. And so Hasidism went from being the black box of Judaism of, we're going to ignore them. They're just a bunch of crazy people. They don't represent us, to, wow, this is like profound, the same way that when we in the West read Greek mythology, we find it, deep and profound, even though we probably don't believe that, the story of Hercules is true, but we all watched the movie when it came out and we've all read, the stories. Martin Buber did the same thing for Hasidic Judaism. He said that Judaism and our folklorish tales can compete with the Western folklore tradition, and there's just as valuable ideas of truth and spirituality in these. And he basically, him and Gershom Scholem a generation later, they made it kosher and respectable to talk about these ideas without being sort of laughed out of the room for like, why are you talking about, folklore? So yeah.
So, okay, so what I mean, first of all, amazing. And they made it acceptable in intellectual circles, is what you're saying, to talk about these ideas, not just among the folk people, that it really became a course of study that was valuable and in so many ways, and everything. Yet another great class, Daniel. I just want to let those of you who joined us later in the class, I made an announcement. I'll be sending out a survey this week about this course. I'd really like everybody to fill it out. And there's a few of you that have taken the class who I don't really know very well, and I'd like to learn a little bit more about you. Again, we appreciate your support to make this happen. And next week is Daniel's last class for now. I have another course in mind that I'm hoping he'll join us for later in the fall. And Daniel, I just want to say thank you so much for this magnificent series. Really, there's nobody like you. Who was the historian you were talking about, by the way, when you were mentioning?
His name is Zev Elef. He's the president of Gratz College. And he's also, he was one of Jonathan Sarna's, big students, and so
Yes.
sort of the mantle of I'll post if anyone's interested. I just put the
Yes.
link to
Send
the
me
conversation.
that as well. Also, that would be great.
Yeah, I just put it in the chat, but yeah, Jonathan Sarna, just for people who are not familiar, he's sort of the American Jewish historian par excellence. He sort of wrote the book on it. He just retired, I think, a year ago. So now there's sort of the next generation of scholars that are all his students. But really interesting conversation. The one fun fact, this is our fun fact of American Jewish history to maybe whet people's appetite if they want to listen. It took 200 years of Jews living in America before there was a single rabbi in America. And so between 1650, when Jews first arrived in the New World, until 1850 almost, no rabbis, like zero. And so very interesting how Jewish community functioned for 200 years, like really with no leadership. So very interesting story there. We're all glad we have rabbis today, hopefully, but it was a different time. But I hope to see everyone next week, and thank you, Reb Mersha.